and thank you for joining us in this panel discussion on the future of energy. We are listening to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I hear you clearly, and I'm very grateful to
we hear you very well.
This very important meeting. I want to make 9 quick points about the future of energy, if I could. The first, I think, is quite obvious. We will need continuing large increases in the availability of high-quality modern energy in the world. So the future of energy is a continued massive growth of energy. But the difference with the past is that it has to be decoupled from carbon dioxide. So we need a massive increase of energy, and we need a massive decrease of carbon emissions. Indeed, as we know, we have to reach 0 net emissions by around 2050. The climate realities are dramatic. They are worse than we expected in the past. The temperature above the pre-industrial baseline this past year has been more than 1.2 degrees C, and the climate sensitivity and threats are profound. So we need more energy, and it has to be decoupled from carbon. Second, the core solution for this is going to be mass electrification based on 0 or very low carbon energy sources. So we are going to have economies based largely on electricity, but they're going to have to come from low carbon energy. What does this mean? The primary energy sources are going to be the renewables, solar and wind, hydroelectric power, geothermal energy, nuclear energy, perhaps some biofuels, but the ecology does not permit large-scale biofuel dependence, and perhaps niche carbon capture and sequestration, though I think the skepticism about carbon capture and sequestration is quite widespread. So the focus needs to be wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, nuclear as the core. And I think that if we're going to succeed, we also have to understand that despite the anti-nuclear sentiments in parts of Europe, it's unlikely, very unlikely, for the world to succeed without a significant nuclear power usage. The third point that I would make is that we're going to have to convert core applications for transport, buildings, and industry to electrification. Most importantly, our vehicles will have to be 0 net emission vehicles. And I believe that by around 2030, the automobile industry, which will be a very different industry in the future, will be producing almost exclusively electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles or other 0 net emission vehicles as a core strategy. Our cities, our infrastructure, our power grid needs to prepare for that. In the building sector, I believe that heating will be converted to electrification away from boilers and furnaces. And industrial processes, I think, will also shift to large stationary fuel cells and other electrification processes in metallurgy and in other core heavy energy using sectors. Of course, we'll be able to deploy new nanotechnologies as well that are much less carbon dependent. So the conversion of the end use of power to electrification and electricity based on the 0 carbon electricity sources, to my mind, are the key technology transformations. The fourth point is that this means the phase out of coal, and this is a reality that we need to face much sooner than we're facing. Germany's lignite power plants, Eastern Europe's coal does not have a future in a low-carbon energy world. And, of course, this is high politics everywhere, including the United States. But the carbon arithmetic is absolutely unrelenting. There is no place for coal in the well under 2 degree C world. And we right now allow coal to dominate our politics in extraordinary ways. But I think the underlying finances in the United States, for example, of the bankruptcy of the coal industry is really the future. The fifth point that I would make is that we're at the end, or should be at the end, of investments in high-cost oil and gas. The idea of Arctic drilling and deployment, of ultra-deep sea oil and deployment, is not only non-economic at current world prices, but it should not be economical again. And the reason for that is the sixth point, that even with the proved oil and gas that we have in the world, a significant part of that will have to be stranded to stay within the carbon budget. In other words, we already have more proved reserves of oil and gas, and of course, an order of magnitude more reserves of coal than we could ever safely use. That means that the low-cost providers of oil and gas out of current proved reserves should be the world's providers. That essentially means the Middle East actually is a continuing provider. It means Russia as a continuing provider. It means that Canada's oil sands or Venezuela's oil sands or Arctic exploration and development or ultra-deep sea exploration and development is non-economical and makes no sense within the carbon budget. The seventh point that I want to make is the situation in Africa. Of course, Africa needs a massive scale-up of energy access, modern energy services of all kinds. It needs, most importantly, a massive scale-up of electrification, which still reaches only a very small fraction of Africa's rural areas and is only intermittent and of very low quality in Africa's urban areas. So the development of Africa's electricity sector is the highest priority. Given Africa's development priority for world fairness, for European migration, and for other strategic reasons, Africa needs to have the space to develop its proved reserves of hydrocarbons. Africa's not the place to strand the relatively modest amounts of gas and oil on a global scale that are found in Africa. What this means, practically speaking, in my view, is that East Africa should really develop an energy sector built on offshore oil and gas, especially the massive gas deposits off of Mozambique and Tanzania. That could provide the basis for power generation for at least 200 to 250 million people. In the Gulf of Guinea, of course, there will continue to be hydrocarbon development. None of this is big enough to affect the global carbon balance, but it's important for Africa's development. Africa has two other mega sources of power. It has the best sunshine in the world, and so the Sahel, which is strategically a key area of instability, has unbounded solar potential from Senegal, Mali, Chad, Niger, It's the low-cost source of energy for those countries. It should be developed. And the second mega potential for Africa is hydroelectric power, including in the Mono River Basin of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone in West Africa, and especially the 50 gigawatt potential of hydropower in the Inga Falls, Congo Basin area. These are important projects. They're strategic. They require tens of billions of dollars of financing. They should be what we spend our time on in thinking about large-scale deployment in Africa. Of course, for small-scale microgrid deployment, there also are good, smart, low-cost technologies that should be deployed across villages based mainly on solar power. But my main point on Africa is East Africa gas, Gulf of Guinea gas and oil, Sahel and North Africa, massive solar potential, and Central Africa, massive hydroelectric potential. This should be mapped. It should be financed. It can be co-financed with China, with the Asian Development Bank. We need serious projects, and they exist at a technical level, but they've never existed at a political level, basically. And I think this needs to be moved to high politics. The eighth point that I want to make is that any good solutions require regional energy systems. What amazes me about Europe is that it is the world leader in thought about energy, but it is still economic nationalism, energy nationalism, rather than integrated European-wide energy systems. And Europe doesn't even have interconnections from Greece and the Balkans, wind and solar to Europe. It doesn't even have interconnections from the North Sea to Bavaria. And it certainly doesn't have interconnections from North Africa to Europe to send Moroccan sunshine and wind power into the European grid. I think this is a huge deficiency of European policymaking, that you have tremendous natural renewable energy potential, especially around the periphery, but the central countries, Germany and others, are depending on national sources. And even within Germany, we don't have an integrated grid. So we have the paradox of the Energiewende and increasing coal dependence as a result of this, because wind power from the North Sea can't even reach the high energy areas. So I would put a huge stress on regionalization of power systems. Of course, this means to be nice to one's neighbors and to have cooperative relations. The United States and Canada do not have a sensible interconnected energy system. We could be deploying vastly more hydropower from Canada, but we don't have the grid built, and we don't even have the binational vision. Within the European Union, I would have hoped that this could be easier, but I would also emphasize the old idea of Desertec, which is that Europe is surrounded by high-quality solar power from North Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean basin, but it needs the physical interconnections, and it needs the policy interconnections to make a truly Europe-wide low-carbon energy system, and it has never accomplished that to date. The last point that I want to make, my ninth and last point, is on economic policies that would underpin the transition to low-carbon energy system. The first thing that's needed is long-term plans, because without a detailed technical plan, it's not possible to bring about the transformation. This is not about markets, this is about plans. Energy systems are complex, interdependent systems, and they require the planning for land use, the planning for distribution of energy, and the planning over key issues like phasing out coal and the decisions on nuclear energy, which I continue to believe are very important, is a very important energy source for Europe. Also, Europe needs a plan to anticipate the integration of North Africa and even the Middle East into renewable energy grids for Europe. So the first thing is long-term planning. Europe pioneered the long-term goal setting, the 80 by 50 reduction and so forth. Europe is in the world lead on setting goals, but it is not in the world lead on detailed planning that's needed. But the planning requires not national plans, it requires a European-wide plan. The second is that the pricing needs to be long-term, not short-term. The emissions trading system was not a logical idea to begin with. ETS is the wrong policy tool. We need clarity about long-term prices, not spot markets, because spot markets cannot drive the transformation nor the innovation needed. And therefore, instruments like carbon taxation with the committed rising tax levels over a 20 to 30-year period not only are less cumbersome administratively, less politicized, much more straightforward, but they're also the right policy instrument for creating the incentives. I believe that we all got onto tradable permit systems for the wrong reason. In the United States, it was to avoid the hated word tax, but everybody quickly figured out it was a tax like any other tax, but it's a very cumbersome system politically. And as has been observed, it doesn't drive the European incentives because a spot market with a low permit price drives nothing. So we need a longer term price. But I would emphasize also that pricing is only one modest part of the solution to decoupling, because it's the land use, it's the distribution grid, it's the regionalization, it's the building standards, it's the transformation of the vehicle sector, the transformation of key industrial sectors that are not driven by price primarily, but are driven by public policy choices that will be fundamental here. The time is very short. Europe has been in the lead of getting us to the Paris Climate Agreement. We need now clarity of the long-term strategy and plans. Fortunately, Europe has all of the energy resources, the renewables potential, and the advanced engineering it needs to remain world leader in this area. But we are really extremely short of time. And Europe remains decisive for Africa's future, just as Africa's future remains extremely important for Europe's future. Africa without energy is a disaster, not only for Africa, it's a disaster for Europe. And therefore, working with Africa to develop Africa's energy potential in a serious way. But I would suggest, by the way, strange as it may sound, working closely with China as well to cooperate in Africa is extremely important. Africa has vast low-carbon energy resources, but they have no grid, no distribution potential, and that's what needs to be built out. And large-scale projects like Inga Falls need tens of billions of dollars of financing, which really require joint China-Europe financing to help bring this about. So those are my quick observations, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to share them with you today.